All right, so we still have to finish up a little bit because we really didn't finish up with the governing board, but we were really talking about that additional responsibility of both the governing board members and the policy council members. So I just don't want to rush through this, but I just want to finish it up because it's important. So when we talk about 1302-102, we know that both the board and the policy council, in collaboration with the management team, have to develop these program goals in those 4 identified areas that we talked about this morning. But a piece of that is that they are also responsible for working with the management team. So the leadership, the management team, in collaboration with the governing body members and policy council members, also need to address any issues that were identified during an ongoing oversight within your agency, so that internal monitoring of compliance and program performance. So we started out by saying that you, along with the board members, will be receiving this ongoing monitoring data. So that is what this addresses in 1302-102. So that not only are you looking at that ongoing monitoring oversight results, but also you're monitoring what was the corrective action. How was that resolved in-house internally? And then it moves on to, well, let's look at the program goals. What's your responsibility in 1302-102 as it relates to the assessment, which is ongoing, and the monitoring of those program goals to see if in fact you achieve the expected outcomes. So looking at this piece, again, that same language, the management team in collaboration with the governing board members and policy council members will be engaged in looking at those program goals and making progress and meeting them, and will be involved in conducting that annual self-assessment. So we talked about the self-assessment earlier this morning, but you will be involved in that process because part of your self-assessment is going to be not only looking at compliance and all that ongoing monitoring data, but it's also going to be looking at how are you tracking those measurable objectives that were identified in your goals. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I have a pictorial that I'm going to hand out later that really just maps out the whole process of the 3 entities working together in program planning during that 5-year project period, so that you know what you're collaborating on, what you're working together on, and what you're responsible for doing as it relates to that. And then continuing looking at program goals, under 1302-102, it talks about the reporting piece, and we already talked about many different reports that you're going to be receiving, both the board and policy council members, as it relates to that conduct and responsibility, and we're going to identify them in a few more minutes. But in addition to all those reports, the new performance standards are now saying, and they're not really that new anymore since they really came out last November. So we can't keep saying they're so new. But anyway, the performance standards now state that status reports must be presented to the governing body and policy council at least semi-annually. And that's in addition to all the other reports they receive. So that's something new, and those status reports are going to include what? That ongoing oversight data. So you see how involved you are in that data piece, and we're even going to take it a step further because you're even going to be involved in something else as it relates to data. So in the effective governance indicators, it's important that you have strong communication strategies in place between all entities, and that you know that another responsibility is the development and providing to the public the annual report. So, in the management section of the performance standards, we see the governing board members and policy council members coming up again as it relates to a coordinated approach to data management. And what it's stating is that the management team is going to, or program, will establish procedures on data management, but they're going to do it with your engagement because it's going to be presented to you for approval by both the governing board and the policy council. So if that hasn't occurred yet, keep your eyes open for it, but that data management system is something that you will be engaged in and involved in as board and policy council members, because you're going to be looking at, does that management of data address the quality of data? Does it look at the effective use and sharing of that data while really looking at the confidentiality of and privacy of child records? So again, something in 1302-102 that we know is part of achieving these goals, because we started out this morning saying, how can you make informed decisions if you don't have the data that helps you make those decisions and give you the information you need? So it's a huge process that you're involved in. And we're finishing up governing body. We're going to look at an option that in 1302.2 states that a governing body may, it doesn't say you have to and you must, it says may. You may establish an advisory committee that will oversee those key responsible areas of program governance. So if you choose to do that, it goes on to say that there has to be a real formal structure of the way the governing board is going to communicate with this advisory committee, so that there's constant dialogue without giving them full responsibility, because the full responsibility of legal and fiscal oversight is still maintained by the governing board. And then if in fact you choose or may develop an advisory committee, that the officials, the Office of Head Start, or actually the program specialist, somebody needs to be notified that that's what you're choosing to do.
Does it give any guidance about who should serve on an advisory?
It doesn't really give you any, not like it does with the governing body that you have to have somebody with early childhood expertise. It does not dictate what your membership is going to consist of. It's just giving you the choice. But there's a great book. There's another book that I love and always look at and want to share, is the Preamble, Part 1. And it basically gives you a lot of language and conversation about what Office of Head Start was thinking when they made those decisions about the new performance standards. So a lot of people looked at this already, so you could look under program governance in here and see what the rationale and further thinking might have been in the establishment of an advisory committee. But good question, and thank you for asking that. So finally, we're getting to policy council membership. We have our community partners that are so patient waiting this morning, and same with our parents, and we have a parent back there still, so I'm excited to say that parent engagement piece and that commitment that Office of Head Start and Head Start has to the voice of the parents and decision makers and leaders in Head Start has remained constant over all these years, and it's still here. So let's take a look at Policy Council. So their key responsibility is not legal and fiscal oversight. No, no, no. We know that's the board's key responsibility. But what it is their key responsibility is for the direction of the agency, including program design and operation and long and short-term program objectives, and planning. So really, they guide, in a sense, the direction in which an agency is going to go. That's a huge responsibility that I said and mentioned earlier. Just like the governing board had 3 major areas, and then they had those 11 identified responsibilities under it, the Policy Council, you have some responsibilities too. Quite a few, to be specific, 8. So we're going to take a look at each one with looking at the lens that your key responsibility is the direction of that agency. The short-term goals, the long-range goals, and looking at program design and operation. So you as a policy council, parents of currently enrolled, from children that are currently enrolled in the program, and our community representation on that policy council will approve and submit to the governing body decisions about the following. So I'm hoping that you have received this information and have been engaged in that decision-making process. And the first one has to do with activities of active participation of parents in your program, in which you are responsive to the community and parent needs. So how are you engaged in that, in supporting their active involvement in your agency? Because that's part of looking at the direction of where you want your agency to go in collaboration with the board and management team. Looking at the ERSI piece. So we know that that was the piece of recruitment, eligibility, and selection of children. So just as I said earlier, sometimes your roles may overlap with the roles of the governing board, but you are going to have conversations about this to make informed decisions to then send it forward to the board for their approval, for their discussion, and then their final approval. Also looking at applications for funding and amendments to those funding. So that means you actually have to look at that grant application in year 1 and in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, if you're on policy council. Looking at budget planning and program expenditures, and looking at how our policy council members reimbursed for their participation on policy council. If it's a hardship for transportation or getting there or whatever it might be, that is something locally and in your policies and procedures you would identify and address. Also looking at your bylaws and following what your bylaws state in regards to these activities that you're responsible for. Program personnel policies and decisions regarding the employment of program staff and including the standards of conduct for not only staff but for the contractors and volunteers. And we spent so much time on this morning with active supervision and providing a healthy and safe environment for our children, that you're involved in reviewing that and then submitting and having an input, a voice in it, and then submitting it to the governing board for approval. And then looking at procedures on how our policy council members elected, and then recommendations for the selection of a delegate agency. And again, we know then that is moved forward to the board for approval if you should decide to have a delegate agency. So you do have quite a bit of responsibility here. And we can't forget that additional responsibility that we spend so much time on. I'm really looking at ongoing monitoring and oversight data and school readiness data and data on those 4 key areas that help you identify, determine, and make decisions about which direction the agency will go in collaboration with your leadership team and your board. So how long can we keep you? We'd love to keep you forever, but we can't, especially when we find really engaged parents that show such leadership and such promise. However, there's regulations in place. In the past, you were only able to serve on policy council for 3 one-year terms. The new performance standards state that you, if you decide as an agency to change that, you can have a policy council member serve 5 one-year terms. But again, your bylaws will have to reflect that in also your policies and procedures. But what's important here is if you serve more than 1 term, the next year you have to serve, you have to stand for re-election. You have to be elected again. Okay? So with this in place, you can see that it's moving more to the 5-year project period, to that birth to 5 approach, and also to that community assessment now that we do a full one once every 5 years. So we can see why possibly we're moving in this direction. But what can you see as management team the challenge here is with looking at membership and looking at monitoring?
It's going to have to be trained. New people, and there's going to be ongoing training.
Yes, sometimes there's a lot of turnover because we may get our babies at 4 and they go off to kindergarten next year. So we might only have somebody on policy council for a year and then there's turnover. So it's critically important, thank you for sharing that you're going to have a system in place to first track membership, track how many terms a member is on policy council, and then also track not only for our policy council members and friends, but also for board, when were they trained and how often do we train them? So there's that monitoring piece that we want to make sure we're in compliance with this regulation. But you follow what your policies and procedures say as it relates to how many terms you'll have a policy council member serve. And then the other piece here is making sure that a program must seat a successor policy council before an existing policy council may be dissolved. So at no time can we be without a policy council. Is that what that's saying? Yes. So you have to time it. And you do, we already talked about this, you want to establish your policy council as early in the program year as possible, and that's determined by what your definition is as early in the program year. A program must enable low-income members to fully participate on policy council. So if there is reimbursement needed and it's reasonable expenses occur or incur, that in your bylaws and your policies and procedures, you shall have a statement that shows and identifies how you adhere to this, if in fact you are reimbursing them. And it's not defined exactly what that will look like when we say, well, how is that going to happen? The performance standards give you the flexibility to determine that and follow your procedures. Okay, parent committee. Are we happy parent committee still here? Yes, yes. It must be this afternoon and people are tired. Yes, yes. We don't want them to, we didn't want parent committee to go away because that's the voice at our center level. But again, if you don't have the center-based option, if you have other options, when you operate more options locally, you can determine then are you going to have one parent committee that will encompass all the different program options or not. But the piece here that's important to recognize is that parent committee is still a regulation. Okay? It's still something that engages families and engages parents to have a voice at that center-based level. But the important piece here is that there's communication has to be established between whom? The parent committee and policy council. Back and forth communication, yes.
The center-based program, is that an individual classroom within a school?
That's a good question. A center-based program is, yes, classrooms at a center. Center enrollment may vary from agency to agency. So at one center you may have 10 classrooms at that center, and in another center or elementary school, wherever you house that class, you may have one class there.
So we have 61 locations for these early childhood. And so should we have 61 parent committees?
No, and I can't probably, I promise after our session, I'll talk with you if you'd like. I can't answer that right now because I'd have to have more information on how you're structured. But what I've seen in the past, if you've had 3 centers that only house one classroom at each center, but they're close in geographical location, that the agency made the decision, and it's reflected in their policies, procedures, and bylaws, that those 3 classrooms at the different centers combine and meet as one parent committee. So I've seen it done many different ways, but I think the important thing is that parent committee still does exist. And the flexibility on how you design that depends on how many children you serve, the geographical location of all your centers and classrooms. So again, that would take time for me to get more information on that to give you more input.
So just a clarification, the center-based program option is when the kids go into a designated location as opposed to home-based.
Yes,
So
into a
just-
classroom.
Just for
Yes.
clarification.
Yes, because you have the center-based option, home-based, and family childcare.
Right.
But I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit later if you have
Yeah, I
any more
just
questions.
Satisfy that for our agency, we have geographic locations that meet all together
Okay,
for parents.
and your policies and procedures reflect that, and it's in your bylaws. Okay, and that there's representation somehow or other that a policy council member may be elected to represent from that, however it's designed. Okay. So that policy council is proportionately represented by all program options and all, yes, thank you, okay, great. This is an important piece though at the end where it says that a program must ensure that parents of currently enrolled children understand the process for elections to the policy council or policy committee if you have a delegate agency. Why do you think that was added? That they must understand the process for election to the policy council. This was something in addition. I think they really strengthened parent committee and some of their responsibilities also in the new performance standards. But what sometimes happens is we want to get that policy council established as early in the program year as possible, right? So we're under the gun ready for time. However, we have our new families coming in, new parents getting involved, but do they really understand the process of what they're saying? Okay, I'll volunteer, I'll be on that. I think I can do it. They have to have knowledge about what are they actually volunteering for and committing to. And if they don't understand that, that's when you have a policy council that you're going to have a lot of turnover, because on the front end, they really weren't trained or given the tools or the knowledge they needed to make that decision to say, count me in, I'll do it. Okay? So this is now a regulation that we must, as a program, ensure that parents understand that process for election. Which makes sense, doesn't it? It really does. Also, it says that parent committee, a program may determine the best methods to engage family and use strategies that are most effective within their agency and within the community to carry out the following responsibilities. So the first one is that the parent committee advise staff in developing and implementing policies and procedures and activities and services that support children and parents. So they're engaged and involved in that process. There must, as I said before, have to be a system of communication between the parent committee and policy council. And then within the guidelines that have been established by the governing board and policy council, they may participate in the recruitment and screening of potential early Head Start and Head Start staff. But again, your policies and procedures will determine how you adhere to this and what makes sense for your agency as it relates to their responsibilities. So we talked about policy council composition, board composition, policy council and board responsibilities. We've talked about parent committee responsibilities. So now we're kind of looking at what does a process look like. And when we think about the process and the connection between the board, the policy council, and management, there are required reports that have to be shared accurately, obviously, and on a regular basis, so that program planning can occur and that you will be engaged in that process of decision making. So I have a really nice pictorial here, a Venn diagram, and I promised your director that I'm going to send her some resources so that everyone will have some of these things that I'm sharing with you. But it really is a wonderful way to look at responsibilities of the governing board, what they approve or disapprove, responsibilities of the policy council, what they act upon, but then what do they submit for further approval from the board, and then also the responsibilities of management as it relates to day-to-day operations. So as you can see, there's an area of overlap where all three entities are providing leadership and strategic direction, and all three entities are taking action on different things to provide that oversight. Right? So the administration of program governance, we talked about this earlier this morning and we mentioned it a little bit today, really refers to the conduct and responsibilities and all the reports that must be provided to both the policy council and the board. And so we talked about monthly financial statements, program information summaries. So you may want to rethink, what do you consider your program summary information report that you're giving to the policy council and board? What information do you believe that they need after this training, or from any training or from any conversation that you've had as a leadership team? What information would be important for them to help them make decisions, especially when it comes to that ongoing monitoring, oversight data, and the data on school readiness, and the data and progress in meeting the measurable objectives as it relates to those goals. And then looking at enrollment reports, reports on meals and snacks, the financial audit, being engaged in receiving results of the annual self-assessment process, and actually the plan of how you get it done, looking at the community-wide strategic planning and needs assessment, which we call the community assessment, and you probably need to get the executive summary or the report and read it and then understand the recommendations that come from it and how does that impact program planning and the direction of your Head Start agency. And then getting also information that's sent from the Office of Head Start, be it an information memorandum or program instruction. If your director gets that, she will then forward it to policy council and board members so that they have that information all, because it's knowledge and information as it relates to the PIR, or Program Information Reports. Before we dig a little bit deeper into the fiscal impact on program planning and program goals and how they both align, I think the important piece is here that you're receiving lots and lots of information on a regular basis so that you can gain knowledge to make decisions and act upon either approval or disapproval of some action or some document. So it's critically important that we take the time to really look at what's being presented to us and have the time that we really can read it and understand it so that we can make the best decision for our children, family, staff, and community. Okay? That's, you get a lot of, so somebody said to me, Head Start's so complex, it's getting bigger and bigger, and more is demanded of us, and there's so much more and more to do. But when what comes to you, it's your responsibility as being a policy council member, as being a board member, as being a staff member, as being leaders in Head Start, to understand what's given to you and ask the questions if you don't understand it so that you can make a good decision. So now we're going to let my friend and colleague Angela is going to walk us through a little bit of money, and fiscal things.
I'm going to walk you through it.
impact
I'm not going to hand it out. So, I have decided that either my colleagues really like me and really think that I'm good at this, or they really dislike me, and so they've stuck me in the afternoon lull. You know, lunch is now sitting firmly in all of our bellies. We have been listening intently for 5-6 hours now, and you know, it's starting to be a snicker moment. And then they say, Angela, come on, let's do fiscal. You can do it. So I'm going to try not to get too far into the fiscal weeds because, you know, hopefully, but there are brownies, there are cookies in the background. So, as Vanna is.
Not that I'm happy.
But we're going to talk a little bit about fiscal on a very high, overarching level. We're not going to get into the weeds of it too much. And when we're talking about fiscal here, we're talking primarily about, do our fiscal operations support our program goals and objectives? And what does that look like in our programs? One of the first things that we talk about when we talk about our fiscal operations is breaking down those silos. And I know we have a couple of fiscal people in the room. I come from the programmatic side, so I may be a little bit biased, so forgive me if I step on some toes. I'll talk about my program that I came from, not your program, because I'm sure it's different here. In our program, when we were doing program planning, when we were doing all of these things that we needed to do, all the programmatic people were at the table. You had the human resources were there most of the time, but mental health was there, and education was there, and social service was there. We were all at the table pounding it out. Fiscal would come in. They'd be there for the first 10 or 15 minutes to get their name on the sign-in sheet, and then they were always too busy to do the rest of it. And so they would go off in their cubicles with their little number machines and do their thing. As a programmatic person, I always felt like, well, I'm too busy for this stuff too, so how come they always get a break? And then, you know, I was always politely told, because if they don't do their do, we don't get a paycheck every 2 weeks. So I was like, let them go. I need that little paycheck every 2 weeks. But when we talk about fiscal objectives and our fiscal operations and how they support our program goals, we have to start breaking down those silos. And we have to find some common language that builds those relationships between us rose-colored glasses, gonna change the world programmatic people, and the very pragmatic, we don't have the money for that, fiscal people. So how do we make that marriage work? And now see, I hear you chuckling, I know. And so the first place is, how do we communicate? And how are we building effective communication between the fiscal, number-minded people and us rose-colored programmatic people? And so we have to start talking about what are some common language? How do we use common language? Because my fiscal person would always tell me, God bless Mallory, would always tell me, just get to the point. How much is okay, great. You know, you want this new curriculum and it has all these bells and whistles. How much does it cost? And then I'll tell you whether you can get it or not. And so what we want to do is look at all of our data to inform our decision making, not just the data about how many federal dollars do we get and what is our non-federal share, but also what is our data showing us about our child outcomes. So, this is kind of a diagram of what we want that communication system to look like. So we start out with our program goals and our objectives. And then we have our program data that tells us how are we doing at meeting those program goals and objectives. And then that all ties back to our fiscal decisions and our operations of our fiscal program. Make sense? So far so good? Okay. You'll have to excuse me because I wander when I talk, but then I need my notes for this section. And what we really want to see is our budget a numerical representation of our program vision, of our program goals? Can I look at the budget and tell what this agency believes in and wants to put its oomph behind? And an example of that would be if we run our child outcomes data in our school, we're looking at our school readiness goals, and we notice that our children are not making the progress that we want them to meet in the area of nature and science. Then the following year, as I look at our budget, I should see things like increased funding for PD, for professional development, for the staff around science. I should see increased amounts in the line item for materials to buy enhanced science materials for the classrooms. I may see a supplemental curriculum that is purchased and trained on in response to those outcomes. Yes? Yes, just keep shaking your heads, guys, so I know you're with me. So, what kind of data? We talk all day long. You've heard Clarissa talk about data all day. You've heard Lisa and Captain Bob talked about data. But when we talk about fiscal, what kind of data are we talking about? Well, first of all, we need to keep track of, are we meeting all of these fiscal regulations? First and foremost, right? The number one way to get into trouble is to mess with the money. So we want to make sure the money is right. And so we're collecting information. We're monitoring our ongoing fiscal operations. When programs build ongoing monitoring systems, this is often one of the places that gets left out. We're pretty good at making sure We're monitoring lesson plans. We're pretty good at making sure we're monitoring family assessments. Not so good about internally monitoring our fiscal operations. So are we meeting the regulations? Are we meeting our own fiscal policies and procedures? Are we following them and are we testing them? And then what data do we need on those progress towards those goals and objectives? And then how are we measuring our impact in the community? Because the reality is, at the end of the day, Office of Head Start just doesn't say, hey, Jefferson County, I kind of like those people. I'm going to give them some money. And I'm going to give it some more next year. And ultimately, all of our goals are to make positive impacts in our communities. And so how are we measuring how we're moving that needle for children, families, and our staff in our communities? So what are some of our data sources? And remember, we're talking fiscal. So when we look at some of these data sources, we're saying, fiscal, I'm not sure how that relates. The first one is our community assessment data. How could community assessment data show us a fiscal impact or impact us fiscally? What do you think? What could be some information in your community assessment that could have an impact on you fiscally?
If there's a change in like the kindergarten age, you're gonna have more in early childhood that year.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was another hand back here.
Maybe it shows that our demographics are changing in a certain area of town and we don't have a location there, like a center. So it may mean that those resources will need to shift to that area of town and maybe a new center is built with funds
Good.
or whatnot.
Any others? What about if we were having a situation where we were under-enrolled? We may have to put some fiscal resources behind some additional recruitment strategies. Or if our population becomes all of a sudden more diverse, we may have to look at how are we recruiting and retaining a new set of staff, a new set of bilingual staff to meet that new need. What about self-assessment and monitoring results? We're going to kind of put those two together. What kind of fiscal impacts could we see by looking at self-assessment and ongoing monitoring? Jimmy?
Say the self-assessment shows that our playgrounds are in need of replacement or repair, then funds that would guide the finance, the budget for the following year, that playgrounds and equipment's repaired or replaced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our financial statements, pretty obvious, you know. They're just going to show us our spending habits. If we're spending too much or spending too little. What about PIR, our Program Information Report? What kind of a fiscal impact would that have?
Well, if we're not meeting any objectives that we have, that we would need to go back and figure out, do we need more resources, or human resources, let's say staffing, to accomplish our goals.
So looking at that human resources section of PIR, you know, are we not able to retain our staff? You know, do we have a lot of staff turnover? Well, that could have an impact fiscally because as we're doing exit surveys, for instance, it may be a factor of they're leaving us for more money somewhere else. So can we, within our budget, juggle that? And your audit report and your audit findings are obvious places. Okay. So, what kinds, and we're going to just go through this real quickly because we've kind of talked about this as we're going through, but are there any other data sources that you're collecting in your agency that inform your fiscal operations. Can you think of anything else beyond what we've already talked about? Okay, maybe, for instance, your wage comparability study. As you look at other Head Start agencies or other school districts within your state or within our region, looking at how are you comparably speaking in your wages. And how do you use this data? And this is, I'm going to ask you, how do you use that data to develop an efficient and effective budget? So what are some promising practices that you all feel you're currently using?
Establish priorities, and from a list of needs, then you have to begin to establish your priorities. And that's what we're in the process of doing with our budget.
Okay, so we know we can't do everything we want to do, right? We just don't have unlimited funds. So prioritizing what we can and want to accomplish first and second, and through that whole strategic planning process, right? Good, thank you. Okay, so what is a budget? Obviously, in my household, we haven't learned this yet. Or I have. No, I've learned what a budget is. Your budget is your plan. So at the beginning of every single month, I sit down and I come up with my budget. It's my plan, right? My problem is I don't use prior data to inform my personal budget plan, so we go askew a little bit. But and again, this is saying in the same thing we said before, it's a numerical expression of your vision. My vision is that by the end of every month, I will be debt-free. Unfortunately, ICF's vision for how much money to deposit in my account does not allow for that same vision. Nothing to do with shoes. Absolutely nothing to do with shoes. I just shift, the electric bill money into the shoe line item, and
all of these line items were just moving.
Exactly. But when you're creating your budget, you want to make sure that you're including both your federal share and your non-federal share. And we'll talk a little bit later about what is federal, what is non-federal share. And in talking about your budget, you want to make sure that everything that you budget for is allocable, is allowable, and is reasonable. So when I first started getting to a certain level in my old program, I used to, and I still do it now, and I probably shouldn't say it with managers and Captain Bob in the room, but you learn key phrases, and then you throw them around in mixed company so that people think you know what you're talking about. Those were my first three when I started talking to the fiscal people. I was like, well, is it reasonable? Well, is it allowable? Well, is it allocable? And they'd say, well, I don't know, is it? And I'm like, no, I don't even know what those words mean. I just heard you guys use them a lot, so I used them. So that's our budget. Our budget is our plan. And our plan is based on data that tells us realistically this is kind of sort of where we think we can be. Along with your budget, you're going to turn in a budget justification. And that justification is the details. So your budget gives a very general category. We're going to spend this amount in this category. And then your justification says that these are all the things that are included in that. And then your budget narrative in your grant application says, this is why we're going to be building a new building in South Bend Well, you wouldn't build a building in South Bend because you don't live in Indiana. But you might build a new building in South Louisville, perhaps? Okay, thank you. And so that's your budgeted costs. So your narrative is going to get more into detail about why do we need to spend this amount of money in this line item? Why do we not need as much here as we did previously? All right, administrative and developmental costs. The federal government has given us a regulation that you may not exceed 15% of your total budget in development and administrative costs. Now, the easiest way for my non-fiscal mind to wrap around this is if the money spent directly impacts or provides a service to a child or family, it is a programmatic cost. If it doesn't have direct impact on the child or the family, it is an administrative or development cost, pretty much. There's some gray areas, there's some kind of could be both areas, but for the most part, that's what's going to determine whether it's development and administrative or programmatic. Okay. And now, program costs. This is exactly what it says it is. Program costs are the costs that you incur in order to service your clients, your children and your families. So it's how much it costs you to deliver the education, the health, the nutrition, the mental health services to those children and families. Indirect costs. These are costs that may be allocated across programs. They're costs that are not 100% Head Start. They're not 100% other places. They kind of have overlapping costs. The best examples, the easiest examples of indirect costs are things such as if you have an executive director who has partial responsibility for Head Start, partial responsibility for early childhood programming, partial responsibility for state funding, their salary could be an indirect cost. Audit services. If you, as a school district, the entire school district conducts a district-wide audit, then that may be an indirect cost, versus if Head Start itself hires an auditor solely for that program. IT services is often an indirect cost. Most Head Start programs do not have their own IT department. They share it with another agency. Now, not to get too fiscal, because most of us in here are programmatic people, there are two ways you can do indirect cost. You either do it through cost allocation, which means 50% of my time is spent in Head Start and 50% of my time is spent in state-funded pre-K. So Head Start pays 50% of my salary, state-funded pre-K pays 50%. Or you can do it through a negotiated indirect cost rate, which means across the board, this is the percentage, and this is the percentage. Clear as mud? Good, I have done my job. Non-federal match. The Office of Head Start and HHS funds us based on what we said our cost would be to run our Head Start program. But they fund us at 80% of that cost. And then they say to us, you need to find non-federal share match for the additional 20% of your program costs. So how are some ways that we can meet or do meet here that 20%?
Facilities, transportation,
So facilities, the school board
owns all of our.
owns all of your properties,
Maintains
okay? And does the maintenance for all of them, okay? Transportation, you receive services,
Yes.
free transportation services?
Pretty much.
Okay.
We take some of it every year and we pay back the district, but certainly the district subsidizes a huge amount of our transportation. And they just told us this year that they are going to completely subsidize it, so that we will have more money back to put in our.
Beautiful. What are some other ways that you can get non-federal match? What we used to call in-kind, what we informally call in-kind, parent involvement. Mhm. Okay, what about, do you have any community partnerships with a dentist or a health clinic that may do some screenings for you without charging you and give it back to you as in-kind or as non-federal share? Okay, so you have some of that as well. Okay.
So I have a question.
Mhm. Oh,
In
God.
terms of. It's all right, Angela. I just want to make sure we're all awake. No.
I am now.
That's okay, Angela. You got this.
Yes, I do.
Just, for us, we do cost allocation, and we also have a state indirect cost rate that is already mandated by our state. So we have blended programs, so therefore, we can count some of that in non-federal share match in terms of the salary. Is that, I'm asking you, in terms of the salaries of our employees? No, that's indirect cost. Because they're blended.
You can't count indirect cost as part of your non-federal share because.
I know that,
Oh,
but what I'm
okay.
saying is,
That's,
no,
misheard.
what I'm saying is you can do one or the other.
Mm.
Yes,
Yes,
Yeah.
that's all I'm saying.
yes.
You just
Yes.
want to ensure, when you are physically looking at your entire program, that, and especially in your situation where you have a blended program, that you are properly cost allocating.
Yes, we are cost allocating. for sure.
Not saying properly.
Properly.
No, I haven't seen anything that was improper, but we just want to make sure that we're properly cost allocating. What we've seen across many programs is they might say, our CFO is 80% Head Start and 20% the rest of the program, and once we start digging in a little deeper, we see that, well, geez, there's a whole fiscal team that's working on Head Start, and really the CFO, the majority of the time is spent with, you know, LIHEAP or whatever the case might be, you know, a different piece. And so when we're looking at that cost allocation, just make sure you have a complete plan in place so that it's, you know, clear.
Right, and we use a formula because our program has become really universal in its blending with the state preschool program and Head Start. So we actually use a cost allocation formula that is calculated from that. you know.
Because
So as long as your methodology
Yes.
Exactly.
is making sense and you. You didn't trip me up. So we're talking about all of this stuff. Well, what's the governing body's role in this? Well, governing bodies have a pretty significant role when it comes to non-federal share, because you all as governing bodies have, governing body representatives have the ability to help influence that. All of you are a part of this community. And all of you have community connections that are different from others. So as we're looking at the comprehensiveness of our program, how can I, as a governing body, using the connections that I have in the community, offer something to our program free of charge that they would have already had to spend money on? And that's the key to non-federal match. So it's not about how many donations can we get in and send back out, but the key is, would we or could we spend federal funds on this item or on this service otherwise? So if the answer is yes, I would spend federal funds on this service, then if I get the service free of charge, I can then count it as a non-federal match. Versus, say for example, someone in the community gives you a whole bunch of baby clothes. Would you use those baby clothes in your center? Would you have bought baby clothes with your federal dollars? Probably not. We don't typically buy clothing for our children enrolled in our program. So that would be a great donation that we could then serve as the go-between to send it back out to the families. And it's a wonderful donation, but it would not be able to be counted as a non-federal match because we would not spend federal dollars on it. Okay? The other piece of it is that you want to make sure, as you are looking at those monthly financial statements that you receive as a policy council and as a governing board, that those projections and those reports include your non-federal share, so that you're tracking all throughout the year that non-federal match to say, okay, we're going to make it, or oh, you don't want to get to month 10 of your 12-month budget year and say, oh my Lord, we are $1 million short on non-federal share. So you want to track that the same way that you track your federal dollars all along the way. Some questions to consider. Do we have enough federal and non-federal funds to remain financially viable? So, can we pay the bills? Can we stay afloat? Can we stay in the black? And then, what are the main expenses? Are our main expenses in line with our budget projections? So, you don't want to develop your budget at the beginning of your program year and then wait till month 9 or 10 and say, this is how we're doing. Oh shoot, we're going to be out of money at month 10 and a half. What are we going to do? Conversely, you don't ever want to give the federal government back any of the money they have given you. I don't ever plan on giving ICF a dime back of what they've given me. I'm very appreciative of what they give me, and I show my appreciation by spending every dime of it. And a couple more. But you don't want to get to this situation. So as you're going along throughout your program year, this is one of the reasons you have monthly reports on your financial situation to your board and your policy council. So board members and policy council members, as you're going along, they're projecting, okay, we've spent this much, we got this much to go. The question is, are we going to be able to spend that? And start tracking those practices so that you can not have to do so many budget modifications throughout the year. Our expenditures appropriate. This is one line item that I will tell you one story about when I was in the program. I come from we worked in a very large program. We had just under 100 sites. And our policy council got very good at focusing on particular line items in our budget every month. One of the line items that they continually questioned was lawn care. So they would track lawn care with the most interest I have ever seen anybody put to any one line item. Well, we spent $2,000 last month on lawn care, but I went to my center and the weeds were up to my knees. So explain to me where these $2,000 went and who was cutting the lawn. Or, I know my Uncle Jed has a lawn service, so, he could give it to us for a better price. Or, I live in South Florida, so we have lawn care year-round, but it slows down a little bit for a couple of months in our winter. So then it was, well, we didn't spend anything on lawn care. So it's just kind of tracking that throughout the year. And the other piece is, are we following the trends of the sources of our funds? So, are we keeping track of what's going on with the federal budget? Are we thinking about what if we are flat funded for next year? So what if we're getting the exact same amount of money, but the cost of living goes up? What are we doing about that? The cost of milk has gone way up, but we're still getting the same USDA reimbursement. State funding. What if it takes a dip? How are we projecting for that? How are we tracking for that? How are we planning for that? Are there significant variances in line items? So for instance, if we have a certain amount in personnel, but we end up 3 out of the 4 quarters, we have 3 managers' positions vacant. That's a huge chunk of money when you start looking at salary and fringes that we're now going to have to shift, not necessarily always a bad thing, shift to make sure we spend. But as we look year to year, are we starting to see trends? Are we running in the same position where we're always putting too much in this line item and then having to shift it? Or are we always not putting enough in this line item and having to pull from other places? So looking at those trends, that data, so that we're not just doing the same budget every year, like I do at home, doing the same budget every year, and then saying, oh, I got to make the same changes this year. So how are we tracking that and moving it forward? And where are our potential risks? Making sure that we're mitigating as many of those risks as we can. And I am turning it back. Any questions on fiscal? Thank you for that one.
It didn't rain. We didn't step you up. It's a couple of minutes before 2:30, and we were going to break, so why don't we go ahead and break from 2:30 to 2:40 in 10 minutes, and then we'll finish up, okay? Thank you. While we took our break, if you look at your tables, I just want to share with you that Victoria, I told you I was putting out, my colleagues have put out the tables. It's governance and planning. It looks like some of you have it in color, others weren't able to get it in color, I'm sorry. But basically, it's like your one sheet kind have a cheat sheet. It has everything that we talked about as it relates to the governing board, policy council, and management, and those key factors and regulations that we have to adhere by. I wrote down the regulations, so when we think about governance, we know that you have a very important piece in the planning as you move forward with this agency. So it basically talks about using the ongoing monitoring results and the data on school readiness and all those other reports through the to conduct your responsibility. Every time I go down, chocolate,
Would you like to have a Mountain Dew or something?
my mouth is turning to rubber. I'll sleep well tonight at the hotel I go. But anyway, I thought it was a nice way though to look at the roadmap because really you have that 5-year plan. So in year 1, you're really identifying those priority areas for the next 5 years. You have those short-term objectives, which is your annual planning just for year 1 that you'd like to accomplish as a result of your self-assessment, your ongoing monitoring data, your community assessment, external data. So that builds upon this progression, and at the end of the 5 years, you will identify what quality outcomes you want for your children and families and staff. And then on the right side, it has those 4 key areas that we talked about where you need to collaborate with the management team to establish goals with measurable objectives in those 4 areas. So I just thought it might be something nice to just have and share maybe with staff to kind of bring it all together in one place. Okay, so let's see where we're at now. This is just a planning sample calendar. In order to have effective governance with the policy council, the board, and management team, if you don't plan, you're planning to fail. So as we talked about so many things today that you're responsible for doing and approving and submitting to the board and what management is required to send forward to policy council to get input to go to the board, you have to have a plan in place to execute that and implement those things. So you might want to look at your program timeline or your program calendar and make sure that those things that need approval that impact other mandated activities that are required by Head Start get accomplished in a sequential manner. So you never have an uh-oh moment and you think, oh my goodness, we really can't complete that grant application because the community assessment wasn't completed in time. Or we can't review and possibly revise our selection criteria because we don't have the data from the previous year. We don't have the updated or revised community assessment to help drive that decision making. So you know in Head Start, one thing impacts another. So it's critically important that however you want to develop your program calendar as it relates to governance, it should be something that you have so that you make sure you can accomplish what it is that you need to get done in a timely manner as it relates to those mandated deadlines, okay? So that's just a sample up here for that. We already talked about the flow of reports. So usually management will submit the report to policy council, and then policy council will engage, interact, converse, have questions, and then make a decision if it goes forward with an approval to the board for final approval. Conflict of interest is both for the members of the governing body and the members of the policy council. So we cannot, governing body members cannot have a financial conflict of interest. They cannot receive compensation for serving on the governing body. They cannot be employed or not have members of their immediate family employed by the Head Start agency, or operate as an entity independent of staff that are employed by the Head Start agency. And the conflict of interest is the same for policy council. They can't have a conflict of interest or even the appearance of a conflict of interest, because that would be probably a conflict of interest. Not receive compensation for serving on policy council or providing services to the Head Start agency. However, we know that your agency can have a policy in place where policy council members can be reimbursed for reasonable expenses if they're low income. And then staff, this came up earlier, staff may not serve on policy council. However, parents who occasionally substitute can. And that came up in the regulations right under there because there's a lot of confusion about that. But you have to determine as an agency what is regular. So you have to identify that in some way. Okay, do you have an impasse procedure?
Question.
Yes.
For an advisory committee, can an advisory committee member be a staff member? Can they be a paid attorney?
I will defer that to Captain Bob, but remember earlier this morning we talked about membership on the advisory committee, and there's no regulations that I know of in the performance standards that identify any membership on this advisory committee. So I would look at the preamble, and if you are interested, maybe contact your program specialist to have a further conversation about it. But I think there's some flexibility with that composition for the advisory committee. We don't have regulations that specify like they did with board membership or policy council membership. So basically, the secretary shall develop policies and procedures as it relates to internal disputes within a Head Start agency, and the meaningful facilitation and consultation about decisions that the governing body and policy council have. Some agencies have already developed their impasse procedures and they're working really well and they adhere to the new regulation, and that's fine. But when the Head Start Act came out, it said that Congress was going to develop these policies and procedures, and it didn't occur until 7 years later with the new performance standard. So now it's identified in the performance standards the steps that an agency should take when they are resolving an internal dispute, meaning policy council is not in agreement with the board, or the board is not in agreement with policy council. But I think the important piece here is that in order to look at decisions that are made in this process, an agency, the collaboration is between the board and policy council together are going to write those written procedures for how you resolve a dispute. So that's that collaboration. It's not the board's going to write it. Policy council and the board together will write those, or will establish those written procedures for resolving an internal dispute. So if there is a disagreement, you require the governing body and the policy council to notify the other in writing why it does not accept a decision. And this is outlined in the regulation on the steps to follow. But as again, some programs already have a good impasse procedure in place already that adheres to this. Describe a decision-making process and a timeline to resolve the dispute. If the decision-making process does not resolve or does not result in resolution, then the governing body and policy council must select a mutually agreeable third-party mediator, and if it's still not resolved, they will then select a mutually agreeable arbitrator whose decision will be final. So we do have to have an impasse procedure in place per the regulations. So why are you here? We're told that you had to be here. I don't know, but you're here, and I hope and you were a great audience because you really were very, very engaged, and I really appreciate that. But it's regulation. It's a regulation that an agency must provide appropriate training to both the governing board the policy council, if you have an advisory committee, to the advisory committee, and if you have a delegate to the policy committee, they must have a training that includes training on the performance standards and also includes specific training as it relates to 1302.12M, which relates to eligibility, and we'll talk about that in 1 minute. But the purpose behind this is to ensure that you as members of Policy Council and the board will be able to understand the work that you have to do and to make the decisions that are needed so that you can effectively oversee the agency and oversee and participate as an engaged member of governance. So what does 1302.12 state? Basically says that a program must train all governing board members, all policy council members, management, and any staff on your team that touches eligibility on applicable federal regulations and program policies. And then it goes on to say what the training needs to include. So today's training, I'm sorry to say, we can't document that I trained you on this, because this is a separate piece of training that you're going to have to track for both policy council members and your board members. But there's specific identified areas that have to be targeted in that training that talks about respecting and treating families with dignity and looking at methods to complete accurate eligibility information. So again, this is something that we want to track along with the training that you do on the performance standards. Then it goes on to say that a program must train all governing body members and policy council members within 180 days of their start of their beginning of their term. So another piece to track. Not only are we tracking the number of terms that you're serving, but also we're tracking the 180-day deadline. And you must develop policies and procedures on how often training will occur. So that's a flexible program decision or agency decision to be made. So I think we're not going to, there are many questions here, but I think these are just questions for reflection. What I'd rather us do, which I think is going to be a little bit more beneficial, a couple of things, okay? The first thing that I would like is that we looked, actually let's do this first. Let's do governance in action. There's a handout on your tables and it looks like this. And this, I think, would be much more beneficial for us than just to go through some guiding questions on a template. What I'd like you to do is look at this, and it talks about governance. So what I want to know is, for you, at a table, you can do it individually or with a partner, to look at what is working really well when it relates to governance in your agency. The second column is what areas need to be strengthened. You're doing it okay. You really are. You're okay. But you really want to move the bar and just get it up a little bit higher. And then the last one is ideas for quality improvement. What areas really jump out at you that says, you know what? I think we can do a better job in really designating time during our policy council meetings to really have discussion about the documents we're receiving and conversation about it and build that into our meeting time or whatever it is. So if you would be so kind to just have a moment to reflect. I know it's helpful for me when I reflect, and you've taken in so much today and you've been a great audience, but I would appreciate it if you work with a team member.
I would actually like to ask for our management team to spread to different tables so that they can practice for discussion.
And also we're going to multitask because we are Head Start. We're always multitasking. While you're doing that also, we are going to put little stickers out at your table. table, orange stickers, and I'd like you to go back to our pre-assessment and kind of see where you are now in governance. Take a little orange sticker and place it on there for me so that I can see where we're at the end of the day. Okay, thank you. All right, let's look at the first question. A formal governing structure must include a governing body, a policy council at the agency level, and a policy committee at the delegate level, and a parent committee. True or false? True. Perfect, great. Number 2, the governing body is responsible for the direction of the program, while the policy council has legal and fiscal responsibility. False. False, very good. We know governing body has legal and fiscal responsibility. Okay, governing bodies and policy councils should use data to carry out their work and to make informed decisions about the program. True. True, because using data is not optional. Okay. Before a governing body establishes an advisory committee, it must have OHS approval. False, very good. Just they need to be notified. A governing body must relinquish legal and fiscal responsibility to advisory committee. False. You are excellent here. Policy council and policy committee members can serve 5 one-year terms, but they must stand for re-election each year. True. Perfect. Programs must reimburse low-income members if necessary, reasonable expenses incurred to enable them to fully participate on policy council or policy committee. True. Great. The Office of Head Start no longer requires programs to establish parent committees.
False.
Programs must ensure governing bodies, advisory committees, and policy councils receive training on all program performance standards, including those related to eligibility.
True.
The Office of Head Start encourages programs to establish impasse procedures should their decision-making process breaks down. False, because all agencies are required to establish those impasse procedures. Excellent, you did a wonderful job on that. Well, I'm looking over here, and it surely sees that some of you have gained some knowledge during this time together. It really has been an honor to be with you today, truly an honor. We're going to close with a video, and then Captain Bob will have some comments. Okay? Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's me at 4 months old. I'm one of the thousands of little miracles born into poverty every day. That's my mom. She's 17 and never finished high school. She's got some big dreams for me, but she's alone and she's scared. This is my first birthday. That's my grandma, my cousin Tanya, and her boyfriend Kevin. We all live together. It's cold and crowded. I hope we move soon. I don't like Kevin. He's always yelling. This is my second birthday. We're all at daycare, strapped in watching TV again. I wish I could just run around. This is my third birthday. My brother William's taking care of me while my mom sleeps. She works the night shift, so we can't turn up the TV, but we get to go to bed whenever we want. This is my 4th birthday. We're sleeping at my aunt's this month. I don't know when my dad's coming home, but I'm hungry and I miss him. This is my 5th birthday. This is my first day of kindergarten. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I'm unprepared because I didn't get the right start. I'm twice as likely to be in special education. 30% more likely to never go to college. 70% more likely to be arrested for a violent crime. Become a teen parent drop out of school, never hold a job, spend the rest of my life in poverty. My mom plays with me all the time. She smiles a lot now, and she knows she's not alone anymore. Grandma, Tanya, and Kevin read me a story every night before I go to bed. I go to my school every day, where I get to run and play and see all my new friends. Will and I go to preschool together. Today we learned about dinosaurs and played a counting game. Every morning, my dad and I brush our teeth and eat breakfast together. We have our own place now, and I know we'll always be together. This is my first day of kindergarten. I'm rested, I'm eager, I'm confident, I'm curious, I'm prepared. I'm ready. I am your future. Change the first 5 years, and you change everything. Anyone interested in investing?
I had to end with a quote, me and my quotes, but far and away, the best prize that life offers is the chance to do work hard. At work worth doing. Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you for doing the hard work, the work that really makes such a difference. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Excellent job today. Thank you all. And thank you all for being here and spending your day here. I know that we all have different positions and different responsibilities and life responsibilities. Watching that last video, it brings a tear to your eye, seeing the beginning and maybe what it is and what it could be and vice versa. I had a chance, and I think I might have told this story before, but I had a chance to close out at the National Head Start Association meeting a couple years back, and I was part of a closing panel, and so before I arrived, I was told I had 15 minutes, and so as Felisa and everyone knows, I have a hard time saying my name in 15 minutes, and so but I knew I had 15 minutes, so I put together this presentation for this talk for 15 minutes, and I arrived, and it was in Nashville, and then I was told I had 10 minutes. So then, of course, I'm looking at what I had, and I had like 10 slides, and most of them were pictures of my grandbaby, so like just have her up there and talk about her. So then, individuals were speaking before me, and I kind of was, I was listening and also looking at my watch, thinking, there's absolutely no way I have 10 minutes. And the crowd was slowly disappearing because everyone came in with their suitcases. And so slowly everyone's like going out. And of course it started off with maybe like 300 people but slowly everyone's, truckling out. And an individual spoke before me, and she was a Head Start parent. And she was part of the policy council, and part of their initial kind of conversations was, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so she wrote down, I want my PhD. She didn't have a high school degree. She was a parent. And she was showing pictures of her child, a Head Start graduate. But she was showing pictures of her child in India in Africa and Central America as part of a medical team. And as she was talking, she was not only reflecting on her child, but also on herself and the many blessings that the Lord has given her. And while she was part of Head Start and the Policy Council, and she received her GED, and then she received her bachelor's, and she continued on and received her master's degree. And about a week before her closing, she defended her PhD, her dissertation. And she was starting a nonprofit for the area where she lived. And so I believe that Head Start not only offers an opportunity for our children, but also our families. And I would ask you all what you want to be when you grow up, and what do you want from Head Start. And I think we all have opportunities, and I think we see many opportunities every day. In my experience in Head Start over the years, I believe that when we have engagement from the board, and we have engagement from Policy Council, engagement from our leadership team, we make a difference in the individuals' lives and our children's lives. And I have a team of individuals, not only in TA, but also in our program specialist, of about a total with TA and also our program specialists, so over almost 70. Yeah, because we got 40 some on with TA. Yeah, so just about 70 people. And last night, every night I reflect on each day. I give a reflection and I figure out where I sinned and what I've done wrong for the day and what I did good for the day and what challenges I had and did I meet any of those challenges. And I wrote a quick note to my staff last night just about the holidays coming up. And just being thankful for being able to serve them and also being able to serve you all. I think that, here in Jefferson County, we're serving about 1,500 children and families. And so the board has not only their responsibility for Jefferson County, for the school district, but also Head Start. And taking time out of your schedules and being here, I know that the leadership team appreciates that, and I know the Policy Council and I appreciate that coming out. I'll have to remember in the future 3 and 3 only, unless I want to put a little powder on my face. I'm getting emails from central office. We keep on looking at the news, we're not seeing you yet. So maybe it'll be Clarissa most of the time. So. But we really do appreciate all of your time and efforts, and as we continue to grow together, you'll get sick of me and you'll see me more and more. But please remember to do all that you can, and for the new Policy Council and the parents that are involved, please be completely involved. It's not only about your child, but it's about all the children that are being served by Jefferson County. And I think that it could grow from there. You could receive your PhD, or as the vice president of the Florida Head Start Association, who is a parent. And so I think we all have those opportunities, and so I thank you all for your dedication, not only for the program, but also what you're doing for your children and families. So thank you all very much. I do appreciate everything that we're all doing, and we'll continue to work together to meet our challenges and to continue to serve our children and families. So thank you all very much.